Hello everyone, this is DrBarai. I'm a consultant in emergency medicine. In this video, we are going to talk about Brugada criteria. Probably you have seen a lot of your ECGs with a wide complex tachycardia, and sometimes it can be very confusing. Sometimes it can be very difficult to differentiate between a VT or ventricular tachycardia and SVT with a supraventricular tachycardia with aberrancy or Van block. I ask this question all the time, how to differentiate between VT and SVT. There are different ways to differentiate between VT and SVT. One of them is Brugada criteria. In this particular video, we are going to talk about Brugada criteria and how we can use this in our clinical practice to differentiate between VT and SVT. So let's dig into it. So in this Brugada criteria, there are 4 steps. And this is, if you follow the step 1, then this is VT. If it is not fulfilled, you go to the step 2. If it is fulfilled, it is VT. If it is not fulfilled, go to step 3. If step 3 criteria are fulfilled, it is a VT. If it is not, go for step 4. And if all the 4 criteria are dismissed or not fulfilled, probably this is SVT with aberrancy or SVT with Van block. So the very first step in case of Brugada criteria is something called the absence of the RS wave. To keep it simple, we can call it concordance of the QRS complexes. Now, in the very first step of Brugada criteria, we look at only the chest leads V1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So in these chest leads, we look at the concordance of the QRS complex. Now, what is concordance? Let's keep it very simple so that everybody are in the same page and everybody can understand it very clearly. To demonstrate it, I have shown you a normal ECG. So what is a normal ECG? There is a P wave followed by a QRS complex, followed by an ST segment, a T wave, and TP segment. The P wave again, QRS complex here, ST segment, P wave. So this goes on and on and on. So that is a normal ECG. Now let's focus on the P wave. If you carefully look at it, there is only a positive deflection above the isoelectric line. So this is a positive P wave. Same thing is true for the T wave. There is only a positive deflection above the isoelectric line. The ECG machine is calibrated and programmed in such a way that any electricity that is going towards the electrode is considered as a positive deflection, and any electricity is going away from the electrode is considered as a negative deflection. So you will agree with me that the P wave is only above the isoelectric line, and same is true for the T wave. We call this a concordance. Concordant P wave, concordant T wave. This is not, however, true for the QRS complex. In QRS complex, there is a negative deflection, which is the Q wave. There is a positive deflection, which is the R wave. And there is another negative deflection, which is the S wave. So the QRS complex is both above the isoelectric line and below the isoelectric line. This is called a discordance. So normally, the QRS complex should be discordant, that is normal. If this discordance is absent, that is called a concordance. Concordance is abnormal. So if you look at the V1 to V6, in all the 6 limb leads, there is concordance and the QRS complex is wide. This is highly likely to be VT according to the Brugada criteria. So let me show you some of the concordances. So you have got a negative concordance. In this particular ECG, this is the baseline here, and the QRS complex is only negative. There is no positive, there is no P wave here, there is no R wave here. This is just a little slurring of the ECG machine that is giving this, but this is not an R wave. So you have got the T wave followed by a negative deflection. So if you find in V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6, in all of them, there is a negative concordance, according to the Brugada criteria, this is very likely to be a VT. So this is negative concordance. How the positive concordance looks like? Let's have a look. So this is how a positive concordance will look like. In this particular ECG, the baseline is somewhere here. And the QRS complex is only positive, only going up, 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 above the isoelectric line. So this is a positive concordance. And again, if you find positive concordance in one side and negative concordance on another lead of the on the chest leads, that is not Brugada criteria. According to the Brugada criteria, in all the chest leads V1 to V6, there should be either a positive concordance or a negative concordance. You cannot have both. So to summarize this step 1, let me show you all the three different patterns that I have talked about so far. First of all, there is a normal ECG where the QRS complex is discordance. This is not a VT. If there is a negative concordance or a positive concordance in all the chest leads V1 to V6, highly likely to be VT according to Brugada criteria. So that is step 1. So if the step 1 is fulfilled, this is highly likely to be VT. If not, we'll go to the step 2. Now step 2 is relatively simpler. This is called the Brugada sign. What is Brugada sign? The Brugada sign is from beginning of QRS complex here to the nadir of the S wave, which is here. If it is more than 2.5 small square or more than 100 milliseconds, that is highly likely to be VT. This is called the Brugada sign. Now in this particular example, however, if we calculate, there is about 5 smaller square from the beginning of the QRS complex to the nadir of the S wave. This 5 smaller square is equivalent to 200 millisecond, which is well above the threshold for this Brugada sign. So this particular person has got Brugada sign present, which means highly likely to be a VT. So let me show you the step 3 now. If this step 3 is something called the atrioventricular dissociation, let me show you what happens here. So if you carefully look at it, there is a QRS complex, no P wave before that, there is a QRS complex, suddenly there is a P wave followed by a QRS complex. However, there is no happy marriage between the P wave and the QRS complex because the P wave is sporadically appearing here and there, and in the rest of the other cardiac activities, there is no evidence of the presence of a P wave. So this is not a happy marriage between the P wave and the QRS complex, and that is what is called the atrioventricular dissociation or AV dissociation. Let me show you another example here. So once again, there is a QRS complex, white QRS complex, white QRS complex, white QRS complex. Suddenly you will find that there is a P wave followed by a QRS complex, but this PR interval is coming out of nowhere in the rest of the other QRS complexes which are not preceded by a P wave. So this is the P wave which is coming from the SA node, but then the rest of the P waves which are coming are completely disregarded by the ventricle because the ventricle is in the refractory period, and that is why the rest of the P waves you cannot see. And this is another example here. If you carefully look at it, white QRS complex, no P wave before that, no P wave, white QRS complex, no P wave, white QRS complex. Suddenly there is a little P wave, maybe. And definitely this is a P wave, right? Sometimes the P wave can be fused together with the T wave. So the T wave will look bizarre type. Okay. Right. Now the last step. So once again, if the step 3 is fulfilled, that means if the atrioventricular dissociation is present, it's very likely to be VT. If the atrioventricular dissociation is absent, then we'll go for the step 4. So in step 4, we look at the morphology of the QRS complex. And we don't look at the morphology of the QRS complex in all the leads. We are looking at only in V1 or V2 and in V6. So what are the morphology patterns? Let's keep it very simple. There are 2 morphology patterns we are looking for. One is it can be right Vandermeer's block morphological pattern, where there is a dominant R wave or positive deflection in V1, V2, or there can be a negative deflection in V1, V2, that is a S wave in case of the V1 or V2. We call this a left bundle branch block morphology. So keep it simple. In case of V1, V2 or V6, you're looking for either a right bundle branch block morphology or a left bundle branch block morphology. We'll get into further details with few examples in a minute. In case of the V6, we are looking at either it is a Q S wave. Q and S wave both cannot be at the same time. So we call this Q S wave because we cannot differentiate between the Q wave and the S wave. So basically, it's a negative deflection below the isoelectric line. It is a concordant QRS complex, negative concordant QRS complex in V6. The second pattern that we can look for in V6 is small q and big R. Now, please don't get me wrong. This particular pattern you can see in V6, but also you can see in case of V1 or V2. The difference is, in case of V1 or V2, that will be a right bundle branch block morphology, while in V6, that will be in left bundle branch block morphology. All right. The last, but not the least, is the ratio between the R wave and the S wave is less than 1. What it means? It means that the R wave is small and the S wave is big. And I'll show you an example in a minute. So let's get into a little bit more details. So we have got the right bundle branch morphology where there is a dominant R wave in V1 or V2. We can find either there is a smooth monophasic R wave, or there can be a taller left rabbit ear. I'll show you an example in a minute. Or there can be small q and big R, just like in case of V6. The difference is here this is under right bundle branch block morphology, and here this is under left bundle branch block morphology. In case of the left bundle branch block morphology in V1 or V2, you can have either the initial R wave more than one smaller square, which is 40 millisecond, or there can be something called a Josephson sign, and we'll talk about it in a minute, or the RS interval, which is from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave, is more than 60 or 70 millisecond. In case of the V6, we talked about that, and we talked about the RS ratio as well. Okay, let's get into a little bit more details with a couple of examples. So one of the things that can be quite interesting is that if you find in V1 or V2 a white QRS complex with predominant R wave like this one, and there is something called a left rabbit ear. So if you consider a big R followed by a notch and the small r, it looks like a rabbit ear when the left rabbit ear is taller than the right one. Highly likely to be VT if this left rabbit ear is present. We talked about the small q and R complex, and let's talk about the left bundle branch block morphology. So if you consider the expanded modified version of the QRS complex, which looks like this, there is a small R wave, big S wave is following after that. Now from the beginning of the R wave to the end of the R wave, which is the isoelectric line, if this distance is more than one smaller square, which is 40 millisecond, highly likely to be VT. If there is a Josephson sign, which is a notch in the downsloping component of the S wave, highly likely to be a BT. From the beginning of the QRS complex or beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave, if this gap or distance is more than 100 millisecond, which is by default fulfills step 2. If the step 2 is not fulfilled, but in step 4, if we find that this distance is more than 2 small square, which is about 70 to 80 millisecond, highly likely to be VT. And this picture is taken from the paper by Wellen in 2001. So we talked about the Josephson sign. Let me show you another example here. So there is the R wave followed by the S wave, and in the downsloping component of the S wave, we have got a little notch. And this particular notch is, the presence of this particular notch is called a Josephson sign. So if there is Josephson sign in V1 or V2, highly likely to be VT according to the Brugada criteria. But if you don't follow the Brugada criteria and if you find Josephson sign in any of the other leads, that is also suggestive of VT, to make the thing more complicated. All right, we talked about that from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave. If it is more than 70 or 80 milliseconds, which is about 2 smaller square, very likely to be VT. And we have talked about the V6, and this is a good example. If you carefully look at it, this is isoelectric line here, and there is this big downsloping S wave, isoelectric line S wave. You can call it either S wave or Q wave because we cannot differentiate. The Q wave is a negative deflection before the R wave, and the S wave is a negative deflection after the R wave. Now we don't have any R wave, so we cannot say for sure this is Q wave or the S wave, so we call it a QS wave. Essentially, this is a concordant, negative concordant QRS complex in V6, highly likely to be VT. The other example we talked about, that in V6, if you find a very small R wave and a small Q wave followed by a relatively bigger R wave and the massive S wave. So the small Q, big R, suggestive of VT if it is present in V6. The last but not the least is the ratio between the R wave and the S wave. Now in this example, as you can see, there is the R wave here which is small and the S wave which is quite deep. The ratio between the R wave and the S wave, that will be less than 1. This is highly suggestive of VT if the person has got a left axis deviation. So there are a lot of materials in the internet, and there are a lot of books there who talk about the Brugada criteria. Some good examples are Life in the First Lane, Rebel, Immersive Medicine, Medscape articles, Elim articles, and I have got a few videos in YouTube as well. If you have not done already, please subscribe to the channel, and we have got a lot of other materials coming up over the next few months. You can contact me either directly through email, or you can subscribe to my channel and we'll keep you updated with new videos. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You can write comments or send me an email. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.